Welcome back to PSC's Tech Bites. This video marks episode number 200. It has been a long journey and I want to thank you for watching my videos so far. If you are not yet a subscriber of this channel, feel free to subscribe by pressing the red button in the lower left corner of this video. Today I'm going to explain you how we can use the Sites.Selected permission in SharePoint Online. Specifically, it is an application level permission that we can use in order to consume SharePoint Online, either using Microsoft Graph or SharePoint CSOM and REST. And if we are using SharePoint CSOM or REST, in order to use the application only level permissions, we will need to authenticate our application using an X509 certificate. We can grant permission of type read or write to the target site and many more flavors. This is a really good solution whenever you don't want to have the Sites.FullControl.All permission for the whole tenant and you simply want to have specific permission for an app targeting a specific or selected set of site collections. In order to grant those permissions, you will need to use a tenant admin or a site collection administrator of the target site collection you want to grant the selected permissions. If you think about that, otherwise it would be an hack. So, in order to grant those permissions, we can use a specific endpoint of Microsoft Graph, or we can use the PnP PowerShell commandlets to grant, update, or revoke the selected and granted permissions. From a SharePoint Online point of view, we can grant the read, write, manage, or full control permissions. So, like always, let's move to the demo environment and let's see how to do that in practice. So here is an application that I registered in Azure Active Directory, and this application is configured from an API permissions point of view in order to have the application level permission of type Sites.Selected for Microsoft Graph, as well as the same one at application level for SharePoint, so Sites.Selected again. It is an application that I configured to use certificate-based authentication or client-secret-based authentication, so that the certificate one will be used when consuming SharePoint CSOM or REST, and this one will be used when using Microsoft Graph, and specifically the Microsoft Graph SDK. Then I have created a couple of set collections. One is called Sites.Selected Granted Site, and the other one is called Sites.Selected Not Granted Site. Because under the cover, I will run an application that I'm going to show you, which will create a new list in the site contents of the target site. And of course, in the granted site, it will work, while in the not granted site, it will not work, because we will not have proper permissions to do that. So, let me switch to the Visual Studio application and let me explain you how it works. Here we have a function in a service which will consume SharePoint Online via graph targeting the granted site or the not granted site, and in case of any failure we will see what the failure is, and then we do the same using CSOM, again targeting the granted site and the not granted site. From a setting permission, my application will rely on a tenant ID, client ID, client secret and certificate template and password, as well as the tenant name in SharePoint Online and the URL of the granted and the non-granted site. So, let's see what we do inside of this method. For example, from a graph point of view, when we consume SPO via graph, we simply define the set of permission scopes as .default, because we're going to use an application level token. And we say that we want to get from the settings the tenant ID, the client ID, and the client secret. We create a client secret credential object and we provide it to the constructor of the graph service client type in order to create a new graph SDK client. And then we get the target site that we want to consume, which can be either the granted or the not granted one, depending on the input argument that we will provide to this function. And then we create a new list object that we try to add asynchronously to the list of lists in the target site, and we log if we successfully were able to do that. From a SharePoint CSOM point of view, we do almost the same but using CSOM. So again, we authenticate. Here we use the authentication manager of the PnP framework library. We create a client context of CSOM using a certificate. So we provide the client ID the store name and location, the thumbprint and the of the certificate that we want to use, and the tenant ID of the target tenant. Then we get a context for the target site, which can be the granted or the not granted again. And once we have done that, we check what the level of the user is to see if it is a site admin, if it has proper permissions. And then we again create a new list through the list creation information of CSOM, and we add it to the collection of lists, and we do an execute query async. So, and again, we log the successful result, if any. So let me simply execute this sample application with Ctrl F5, so without a debugger. We can see that we start the application. We are going to connect to the Sites.Selected granted site, so the one where we granted the permissions, and we can see that we successfully added a list to SPO. Then we try to do the same targeting the not granted site, and as you can see, using graph we get an access denied because our application does not have access to the target site. Then we do the same using CSOM, and again we target the granted site, and we see that the current user is an admin and that we can successfully add a list. And then we do the same with the not granted site, and again we get a failure because we are unauthorized to do what we are looking for. So, as you can see, we can clearly have the behavior that I described you. In order to do that, in Visual Studio Code, I used the PnP PowerShell commandlets to connect to the target site, to grant the permissions, for example here, the write permission to the target site, and then we can also use the get PnP Azure AD upset permission to get the granted permissions, or the set to update those permissions. And for example, here we can upgrade the permission level to full control, and then we can eventually revoke the permissions if we want to get rid of them. Just to give you an idea, this is the actual script that I executed in my target tenant, and targeting the granted site, I then authenticated to that site, and using an authorized user account, which can be either a tenant administrator or a site collection administrator right now for that site collection that I have in target, I granted the write permission, and then I upgraded the permissions to full control to make it possible to create a target list. So let me switch to the site, and let me show you that by refreshing this page, we can see that in the granted site, we have the CSOM created and the graph created lists. While if we go to the not granted site, of course, we will not have those lists, because we were not able to do that because we are not authorized to do that kind of operation on a site where we have not granted the permissions to do that. So this is a really powerful capability which finally allows us to do administrative tasks and have access to site collection with a selected level of permissions rather than having the full control on the whole tenant in SharePoint Online. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it useful, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you next week. And remember, subscribe to this channel. Thank you.